So, welcome to today's show. So, today's guest is Noah Healy, who is a computational mathematician and an algorithm developer who's currently got a patent pending. So, welcome to the show, Noah.
Thanks for having me here. It promises to be a great show.
Well, first things first is game theory is a very interesting subject, isn't it? It's got so much depth from the prisoner's dilemma to when you are starting to bring out a film, when's the best time to do that? It's all down to mathematics. So if you can just explain to people who are maybe familiar with that side of things, as to exactly what that is and what's entailed within that.
Sure. So game theory is the mathematics of strategy. In fact, it's I've said this before. It's probably one of the most flippantly named things in human history, and it's a little odd that it's also a recent mathematical development. You would think that with the importance of strategic decision making among people that we'd have been looking at this for millennia, but the earliest work in game theory really dates to the 1900s, and sort of the principal work in the subject was done by genius polymath John von Neumann, who was at Los Alamos, actually developed computer architecture that we are still more or less building on today, was interested in weather prediction and all sorts of other things, and died fairly young of cancer. So it was sort of a bright star in human history. But what game theory gets at and attempts to capture is what is the outcome when two or more agents, that is, things capable of making decisions, each of which has their own agenda, make decisions. So you can have situations where agendas are completely oppositional, are completely concordant, or have every conceivable mixture of those two kinds of qualities. And as more agendas come to the party, the situation gets vastly more complicated. And so it's kind of also amazing that in addition to it coming along relatively recently, once you start thinking about what's going on, it's amazing that we actually learned anything about it at all. But it turns out that there are some very basic and actually useful results that come out of even simple explorations of this topic.
But it's very interesting, isn't it? Because, as you said there's so much application from a strategic standpoint. Many people feel that, I went to school, I did maths, it's never helped me in real life. But obviously, with game theory, it is a type of maths or mathematics that does give you specific actionable points, let's say, to help you to, number one, assess decisions, and number two, to obviously make the right decisions.
Yeah. And I think perhaps even more valuable than that, because of sort of the abstraction nature of mathematics, where it doesn't matter whether you're talking about like Sam and Susie trading apples, or Dave and Bob figuring out an international contract. Numbers are numbers. The same sort of thing applies in strategic situations, and that means that principles of these things can come out. So it's not simply how should I make this next decision that I need to make, but what sort of general principle and what should guide the kinds of decisions I make, even for situations which might be too big, or might even just seem to be too big for you to think through this analysis.
So obviously, from what you said so far, you've got a deep understanding of game theory. What are the variations within game theory? So is there zero-sum games? Is there single-player games, multiplayer games? How does that differ with regards to the application of game theory?
So there are two big axes of category. And in general, there really aren't single player games because things don't become interesting until there's other agendas involved. Um, People do model some single player games by sort of taking the universe on as another player that's making decisions. Uh, Kind of, and then you can sort of work out what sort of agenda you want for the universe, sort of a malevolent world versus a beneficial world and stuff like that. But getting aside from all of those kinds of things, the there's sort of these breakpoints. So there's zero sum and non-zero sum games. So a zero sum game is one where the loss of one player is the gain of others. So a game like poker at home is zero sum. Money isn't created by doing this, but what people bring in gets redistributed among the people. Maybe vanishingly tiny chance in exactly the same way, but that's all that's going on. Non-zero sum, and this will also be a characteristic of the other divide, is obviously a much broader category, because the game could have a positive sum, where, say, people could be engaged in business and trade, where you're exchanging something that you value less for what others value more, and then the more it's valuable and the more that can be provided, the greater the value of the game. Or negative sum, playing poker in a casino where the casino is taking off the rake. It's still the players are bringing to the table, but they're not just redistributing the money they're bringing, they're losing actually money. And you can have other sorts of situations where everyone actually gets worse off. War frequently is a negative sum game. So the division between zero and non-zero sum is sort of a thing that's common to the history of mathematics. We have sort of the one category of things that are easier to describe and analyze, and then the category of everything that isn't easier, and that's almost always the far and away greater category. And so with that in mind, the other big division of games is two-player games, where it's, one person, perhaps you and somebody else, and multiplayer games where it's more than one other somebody else.
Okay, yeah.
Which obviously, again, is a vastly broader category. But there, again, certain principles are maintained, and there's a concept called evolutionary games, where if you have a game structure that has roles that correspond to a sort of abstract overgame, so like trading in a stock market, in one sense, millions of people are engaged in having accounts and brokerages and so on. But in another sense, buyers and sellers are coming together. And so that system could be thought about in terms of the individuals at hand. But that thinking would be very fuzzy and analysis couldn't really be done. But you can also model it as this evolutionary game of buyers and sellers coming together. And that's where ideas like supply and demand would fall out, where the system, by evolving, will come to these convergence points where the buyers and sellers are coming together in roughly equal measure around a common desirable point.
Yeah, so yeah, as you said, with trading, it's a case of to be able to sell something at a certain price, someone else needs to want to buy that at that price, or vice versa. So
yeah. If I could get very, very rich selling shares of Apple for $1 trillion a piece if I didn't need counterparties.
yeah,
but there are no buyers at that price.
I know, because we spoke previously off air, didn't we, about buyers and sellers and options. So I don't know, for the audience who maybe don't know what options are, if you can maybe explain, what options are and how, if at all, game theory can be used in that particular example.
Certainly. So the options market is a part of a large class of financial things called derivatives, and they're basically agreements about agreements, which gets a little complicated to think about. But a relatively simple thing is to just take on that name, options. Options allow you to buy the option to do something. So you don't have to buy, but if you want the opportunity to buy. So what we were talking about before, I actually can buy an option to sell a share of Apple for $1 trillion. Well, I can't. I'm not nearly rich enough. But that's a thing you can do. You can buy an option to sell something, and it will guarantee a counterparty. The problem is that you'll have to pay so much for something that's out of band that you'll wind up losing money. So, for example, somebody like Goldman Sachs would be more than happy to charge you more than $1 trillion to agree to buy a share of Apple from you for $1 trillion, because they're just going to take your money.
It's a premium, isn't it?
Exactly.
It's like what happened on the Big Short. If anyone's watched the film The Big Short, where the gentleman went to all of the different banks and had the option to short, and he was obviously paying the premium per month that almost made him go bust. So it's something that you have to manage in respect of cash flow. If you do feel that the option that you purchased, either in the buying or selling space, is going to bring you some sort of benefit in the future.
Yes. So in that sense, you're thinking, oh, these things are pure risk. Why would I ever even engage in this? Well, the reason why is because trading physical stuff is very inconvenient. If I own a coal mine or a wheat farm or some other bulk good production facility, then I, like every business, need to know what kind of prices and where my customers are and so on. And it would be ruinous to sort of do all of the work, get the product together, go down to New York or London or the big city with 4,000 tons of rice and just say, okay, who wants some? You're never going to sell any. So what you need to do, in fact, is effectively work out the price ahead of time. And since you don't have the goods on option or in action, you need options to cover that, because there's a certain uncertainty. Sure, you're probably going to produce the amount you think you're going to produce, but if there's an earthquake or a hurricane or some, maybe it doesn't quite happen. So the sort of tentative proto deals need to approach one another and to work out what the actual final deals are going to be. And so in commodities, people sort of principally make future trades where they're setting up the deal that's going to happen and then back into that deal that they've already set up when they've finally actually done the production.
Yeah, it's like when, obviously, farmers and people who are buying that stock make deals to say, okay, the buyer will say, well, actually, I don't want to fall under the issue of supply and demand. So I would, instead of paying $100 per kilo, I would rather settle for another price but what I would be guaranteed at that price. Whereas for the farmer, he's got the inverse, saying, well, as you said, if there's an earthquake, a hurricane, a monsoon of some sort, that wouldn't guarantee that he would, be able to produce and sell all the products, then it makes sense for both parties, doesn't it, to actually have a physical futures agreement?
Yeah, although I will take issue. This is a common misapprehension. The marketplace isn't an insurance market. So if the farmer actually has a disaster, they aren't going to get paid without delivery. What the marketplace is helping the farmer do is work against the price risk in the marketplace. So the problem is that you're not the only, wheat farmer in the country. And so what if more or less all the deals are made and it turns out that you didn't get a seat at the table, and so nobody really wants your wheat because all the planning's been done already, and so somebody's willing to take it for cents on the dollar? Well, now you're ruined. So the farmers have to get their seats at the table, and so it's this bizarre situation where both sides are sort of willing to take a worse deal in order to get a deal, but those worse deals are oppositional. So well, maybe everybody'd be willing to trade at $100 a ton or something. The one side might be willing to pay 105 so that they can be sure that they're going to be part of this, and the other side might be willing to take 95 because they also want to be sure they're taking a part of this. And so that creates this middle where it can actually be quite large, and 10% is not wholly ridiculous for some of these marketplaces of a spread that the middlemen who are willing to go in, take the risk, and stand between these deals, and also have the patience and technology and money to pick off the desperate and make sure that they get the worst deal that they're willing to take, to get that spread out and make their money as well.
Yeah, so like we've talked, or like you've said so far, there are different applications to game theory, and you can look at maybe a lot of different situations and apply game theory in each aspect, whether it's zero sum game, positive sum game, or negative sum game. And when you are single player, multiplayer, or beyond. So obviously you've got a patent pending for your work. What does that patent cover, and what is it that you're trying to achieve with obviously your invention, for want of a better phrase?
So the thing we've just been talking about, where there's actually three roles within the marketplace. There's these buyers that are willing to take not the best deal. They would like the best deal they can get, but they're willing to take not the best deal in order to get the business. These sellers who are in the same boat, but have an opposite version of what best deal means. And these informed sort of forecaster, negotiator, middlemen types that have capital resources, knowledge, technology, in order to kind of stitch these deals together. I've found a way to create a three-sided marketplace that has dedicated forums for each of these roles to aggregate together. And so going back to what I was talking about, evolutionary game theory, this system provides a mechanism to effectively turn the market from a millions of players doing all sorts of crazy stuff, unanalyzable mess type of game, to a 3-player evolutionary game where people can choose to play one or two or three of these roles, and their capacity to contribute towards their side performing well is their payoff. So your gains and losses are individual, but they're individual in the context of a well-running system. And so you get the security of many people sort of aggregated together, and that kind of, diversification, at the same time that individuals have individual incentives where your gains are based on your effort and correctness, and your losses are based on your lack of effort or incorrectness.
So are these 3-player games ones that have, let's say, fixed options? So let's say player A has options A, B, and C. Player 2 has options D, E, and F, and etc. Or is it more of a complex game whereby each individual player has unlimited options, and players B's decision to act is based on what maybe player A and player C or player 1 and player 3 are doing in each case? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's sort of halfway. So what's going on is each role has sort of fixed strategy, but infinite options.
Okay.
So
just on that, so they have a specific outcome that they are after, and within that they have unlimited options in order to get there. Is that what you're referring to?
Not really. So it's let's think about, say, a more traditional style of game. So say soccer versus car racing or football.
Okay.
For most of your audience, a football match has a constrained strategic goal. You want to score goals. You want to prevent your opponent from scoring goals. But the number of things that you can do during a football match is highly unconstrained.
Yeah.
There's 11 guys that all can do whatever they want, and there's another 11 guys who are all doing whatever they want. A car race, again, has a sort of highly constrained outcome. You want to cross the finish line first. But because of the way car races work, there's a lot fewer choices that are available. There's passing if that's currently possible, but if you're out there on your own right now, you need to follow the course, and you need to follow the course the best way you can. And the better you are at following the course, the more likely you are to be the person that wins. So there's a lot more strategic constraint in F1 than in football. And, both of them are globally popular super sports. So it's not that, one is better than the other. Unless, of course, you're a fan, in which case, obviously, your opinion's correct. But I'm not much into either of them. But that's sort of the way to think about these things. A buyer, for example, in my system, gets to see what the current available price is, what the future projections of prices look like. And all they get to decide is how much they want to buy. That might be nothing. That might be 10. That might be thousands. That might be however many units they feel like. So they have an indefinite amount of choice. They can sort of choose any number up to whatever they need. But they can't do anything else. They have that sort of one option. These forecasters can put information in about where future prices are going. There's no constraint on where they can move these future prices. But that's all they can do. All they can do is speculate on what the future clearing prices are going to look like. And a seller, like a buyer, sees what conditions are and decides how much they want to participate in conditions that are like that. And so each player has an infinite set of choices to make, but they're in a more constrained situation where the degree to which they follow the course of the entire market functioning, they're going to win.
So it's yeah, like you say, it's within the constraints of the existing game.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it would be trivially easy. I don't know if you guys have Candyland or if it's named something different, but that, children's game where you draw cards and just move the colors.
Oh yeah.
Like a bully could win Candyland by just like, pushing over all the other children and putting their token at the end. But that's outside of the constraints of the game. And if you're following the rules of the game, it's basically going to be random in that case. In this case, as long as you're playing the game, what you're going to get out of it is a functioning marketplace and the kinds of economic returns that are associated with producing commodities or using commodities.
So what happens in any instance where you add players to an existing game? So in regards to the race, for example, because I think it's easier to maybe try and conceptualize. If you were to add, so you had two racing drivers and you were to add a third or add a fourth, how would that change the element of the game and decision making for the drivers, or in terms of your sort of area of expertise, how that would fit in that regard?
So there's two kind of different ways that can happen. In the first case, sort of along with what you're talking about, if you're adding players but not adding roles, so the new players' agendas are very similar to the existing players' agendas, then adding new players effectively will make the entire game function better, for want of a better term. As more players, more perspectives come in, in order to sort of gain victory condition or whatever, you need to be executing the appropriate strategies more effectively. And so the game will, in an evolutionary sense, hone in on better outcomes. And we can see this in the natural world. Island species versus continent species, if something happens that joins an island to a continent, the island species frequently go extinct very, very rapidly, because the continent with the much larger game is evolving much tougher, creatures, basically. The predators are more predatory, the prey is much better defended, and then you get sort of the dodo, this sort of flightless thing that doesn't have any defensive instincts because nothing eats it, and then suddenly something starts eating it and it's over. But the other possibility as you add players is that you could be adding these new agendas or new roles, and that can completely alter everything. Having a new perspective or a new kind of decision making in a system can totally change things. So if you think about just sort of board games, if you're playing a game like Clue, which has multiple players and everybody's trying to win, it's one kind of a game. If one of the players is intentionally just trying to make everybody laugh, it's a completely different kind of a game as a result of that totally new agenda showing up. And so that kind of shift can completely alter your understanding of how a game functions if new agendas are being added to the system.
So new agendas being a new player with, as you said, a different agenda or a different objective from the game.
Yeah, and in fact, that's the core of what my patent is on, because computers are capable of complex action and reaction to stimuli and so on in complex ways. It's possible to create computer opponents that will have clear agendas, and so you can actually add new agendas to a game in a way that will make that game function more smoothly. And in my system, there is a sort of hidden fourth player, the operator, that can take on the information from these buyers, sellers, and forecasters that are operating in these sort of restricted systems, and fill in the gaps, do the communication, measure how much value is actually being added or offered, do the settlements in a fair and transparent way. The computer will never have any friends that they met down at the pub that they want to slip an extra 20 to. And so that situation becomes a new and better kind of game, because we can actually write sort of fair traffic cops for ourselves to manage these interactions.
So what you're saying is that when you add an operator, it also changes the game. So if you can just talk to me a little bit more about that, because that sounds quite interesting.
Certainly. So one of the key things about game theory analysis is that hidden information is very important. And a very sort of obvious example of this is that poker would be a vastly different game if all of the cards were face up. Basically, it wouldn't be a game at all anymore. Right? It would be like war. You just deal out the cards, and the winner would win.
It would just be a game of luck. It would be a game of luck, wouldn't it? On what hand.
So hidden information, hidden agendas. Exactly. Yes. So hidden information, and in particular hidden agendas, create this sort of very different kind of mindset necessary, because while you have some sort of idea of what you want, when you're dealing with people and you don't know what they want, you have to be much more protective. You're not interested in sort of going for the brass ring if the other person's trying to rip your lungs out. So you need to make sure that you've gotten yourself into a space where the worst thing that can happen to you is something that's still acceptable to you, and strategies built on avoiding the worst thing that can happen to you aren't the same as strategies that are built on building the best thing you can build. And so these agendas, in particular transparent agendas, are an incredibly powerful tool for creating better interaction systems. This exists at the social level, where societies that enjoy high levels of trust can operate more effectively and more complexly than societies that have very low levels of trust, but is also something that's technologically exploitable, because while we don't do much of it right now, many of the sort of social algorithms are designed to be as secretive as possible. There's a whole different potential in public social algorithms that could unlock a great deal of economic potential.
In what sense? In what sense exactly?
Well, in the sense that I'm talking about right here, where existing markets are not inexpensive operations. The US government estimates that more than $800 billion a year is consumed in just the operation of commodity exchange. And the United States, while it's a large economy, is not the majority of the global economy. And in many countries, their exchange systems are much more expensive and much less advanced than the ones that we possess. So globally, we're talking about trillions of dollars that are effectively being wasted out of the economy just to have the economy function. So these kinds of systems could reduce that cost and effectively apply that directly to economic growth for industries in countries and around the world, as producing things becomes radically more profitable because selling things becomes a lot simpler.
So how do the options? So here's a question then. So how do the options that you've got available determine the level of power that you've got in an argument or in a debate or in a negotiation?
Well, that again gets into agendas. So in a situation where multiple parties each want things, and those things are intertwined, then optionality can have a paradoxical effect. So if you can make 5 different deals and one of them is something that you'll take, but it's really not great. I mean, it's the worst thing that you'll take. But that's the best outcome for the other party, then they want you to take that worst possible deal. But if they want to make a deal and don't only want to make that deal, the one that's the worst for you, then not having that option would make you better off, because now you'd be making one of these other 4 deals that are better for you than this worst one. So in a negotiation, removing your own options can actually improve your own outcomes. And going back to what we were talking about before, where right now buyers and sellers are both motivated to take deals that are bad for themselves just to guarantee that they'll have a seat at the table. By switching up where security comes from, we get to a situation where we take those bad deals off the table. And so right now, a disproportionate amount of the cost of operating the system is coming from these most desperate people. So a marginal farmer is going to need to make sure that they're at the table. Somebody like Jeremy Clarkson, who's become quite famous, and he very publicly points out that whenever his farm gets into a jam, he just goes and hosts a television show and, cashes a check and makes it all go away. So he doesn't really need to worry. I mean, he does, but he doesn't really need to worry about the hurly-burly of getting the very best deal possible for his grain. But a neighbor of his who doesn't have the option of simply being a multimillionaire and needs the farm's produce to sell, will be willing to take prices that maybe aren't quite as good as he could get. And if he can move into a marketplace that takes that option off the table for him, he gets a lot more money.
But it does not suggest that, if we use the Jeremy Clarkson example, that he's got other options in terms of income streams, that he's less inclined to take a poor deal. So that could maybe suggest, and I'll give another example in a second, that the more options you have gives you more bargaining power, because as you said before, you aren't in a desperate situation. So I'm going to use another example. A male has 7 girlfriends. Because he's got other options, he doesn't necessarily need to conform to the lady's ideas of what she would want from him behavior wise. So does it depend on the question basically trying to come to, does it depend on the game as to whether more options or less options is going to be in your favor?
Absolutely. So in zero-sum games, options are basically always good, because you can always just choose not to take them if they're a bad deal for you. But in these intertwining types of games, where you have a concordance of interest, that's where having an option that's not as good for you can actually make things worse. And managing 7 simultaneous girlfriends, that's a complicated problem. In one sense, if this person's goals are sort of very simple, if they're simply looking for ongoing sexual access, yes, they are having lots of options. But in another sense, in sort of a family and love and building relationship sense, managing 7 other human beings is much more complicated. And those extra options in that case would limit the amount of time to develop these sort of mutual understandings, trust, and relationship that might be available if you only had one wife instead of 7 girlfriends, for example. So the nature of the game and the nature of the agendas are incredibly important in these cases. And if you're in a non-zero sum relationship with somebody that's in a zero sum relationship, that can become very bad for you very quickly. If one of those girls is trying to build a relationship with a guy whose goal in life is to just be a pimp, she's going to not get what she's looking for because it simply doesn't exist, and that's going to destroy multiple lives, hers and others.
Does this come back to what you said earlier in terms of different players having different objectives within the game? So in that example, the male, as you said, it might be a sexual activity that he's after in terms of his outcome, whereas for the female, it's, as you said, family and relationship. And because of that disparity, that's what's causing the chaos in that example.
Absolutely, yes. That kind of situation, where agendas are wholly mismatched, lead to the class of what can be termed psychotic games, where people doing what looks like a good idea to them leads to very bad outcomes. You had mentioned the prisoner's dilemma. That's sort of the psychotic game, where the prisoners really should shut up. It is in their general interest not to cooperate with the police, but it's in their individual interest to cooperate with the police. And so if each of them independently does what looks like the best thing for them, they basically both go down for the crime because they spilled their guts and fessed up and have to go to jail for a long time now. And those sorts of situations are tragic in many cases. Sometimes they're humorously or ironic, where people are trapped in situations where what looks like the right thing for them to do is in fact the worst choice they can make. And it happens, we aren't perfect, and we get into a lot of very stupid and occasionally very evil situations.
Yeah, I mean that's where I first heard about game theory. Essentially, was I was actually watching Prison Break, the series, and it was really off the back of that somehow that I found out about the prisoner's dilemma. And my sort of thought process with that is that it was designed in a way, in terms of the sentencing, to enforce or ensure that people are basically ratting each other out, because that's the way that the game was designed. The other um, sort of normal or basic game theory explanations as well is that if you're bringing out a movie against a rival, you should bring it out on the same day. If you are a KFC and there's a McDonald's nearby, you should actually open it next to the McDonald's. When most people would think, well, it's competition, let's put it away from that. But what the maths essentially suggests is that if you were to put it next to McDonald's, that then becomes an area that's known for food, which then increases your probability of actually bringing in clients. So it's quite interesting that a lot of the time the Nash equilibrium or the optimal situation is counterintuitive.
Absolutely, and that gets into the sort of psychotic games. It doesn't have to be an intentional action. Some player that's trying to put together a group of girlfriends is, in some sense, placing them into psychotic games for his own desires. But the situation you're talking about, where creating nexuses and gathering points is actually individually beneficial, is simply a function of the world, effectively. And so we can be in situations where we're in psychotic or sort of beneficial games because people put us there, or because it's just sort of how the world is built. And that's, those sorts of situations are really where game theory shines, because that abstraction allows the detachment that lets you sort of look at that situation in a clearer light. Because if you're trapped in a psychotic game, it really does make sense to do the thing that is harming you, because of what you're trying to get. But if you can think about this thing in sort of more abstract terms and realize that you've trapped yourself in a role that where you're going to be the instrument of your own destruction, then you can sort of see, oh, okay, I need to step back. I need to separate myself from this situation, and not just this situation, but situations that are like this, and move to a situation where what I want actually benefits me.
So obviously we've talked a lot about the different types of games, etc. Within game theory, and the prisoner's dilemma, as we talked about, opening a KFC next to a McDonald's and going against a competitor on the same day. What are some of your favorite real life applications for the listeners that they can maybe try and implement in their own life without having to be a specialist in game theory, let's say, that they could see results in fairly quickly?
Well, that restriction thing is a good one, and this comes down to negotiation, which is something that happens in many contexts. And this is another one of those great option duality things, where you will, in general, get better outcomes from negotiations where you have a very high lower bar, where you want to get everything or very nearly everything you want, and the other person's opinions don't matter so much to you. And so for that context, having economic options when negotiating your salary or benefits at your job, for example, or even perhaps just acting like you have economic options when when doing those things, can really change the path of your life. And so that's a basic lesson that's worth absorbing.
No, like you said, it makes sense. And even going back to the dating situation, that's something that both males and females do, don't they? They pretend they have more options, or that they are someone who doesn't need the other person in order to gain control of that game, whether it's a psychotic game, as you said, or something else. But it definitely does help to try and portray that the option of that particular person is less valuable than they actually are.
Yeah. And in particular, dating models, we're seeing sort of societal satisfaction levels in decline over multiple decades at this point. And even as we see the sort of relationship structures expand, and social sort of commentators generally respond to this by saying, oh my God, why are people less happy? We need to have more options. Well, game theory tells us that we should actually probably expect in sort of these mutual relationship type situations, fewer but better options are going to be better for people than just kind of tossing them out into the deeps and just saying, well, sink or swim, let's see what happens. And so that's a very real challenge, because we don't really have particularly good ideas about what those roles ought to look like in something that's as complicated as families and society.
But does it also come down to the fact that if you have less options, you value those options more, and therefore you are more likely to put more effort into those options? Do you think that also plays a part in it?
Well, that's getting away from game theory, but there is a cognitive cost to decision making, and so having fewer choices allows you to think about the choices that you're making in a more valuable fashion. So another kind of insight that comes out of game theory is, when doing option restriction, one of the most valuable things you can do is come up with good rules of thumb that will take large numbers of options off the table for you without taking a lot of time or effort. Simply having things that you will not do, it can bite you. It might take the very best thing that you could possibly do off the table, and there's always going to be that story of the person that's completely outside the box and finds the brilliant solution. But day in, day out, as people have to make many decisions to sort of build their lives, analysis paralysis is a real thing. And if you are constantly trying to figure out what the very best thing that you could possibly be doing is, you'll never actually do anything. So building and principles and sort of building the best principles you can and sticking to and living by those principles is a very good generic strategy for dealing with large, complex, unknown counter agenda type game situations. And again, that's something that shows up in the mathematics.
Well, as you said, it's definitely a balance, isn't there, between overthinking and acting too rashly. And there's that middle point that probably is that Nash equilibrium that is the right amount of thinking and acting. Something I heard once that is quite interesting, really. It said there was a king who had two options. He had, let's say, a left street and a right street. And this was obviously, as you said before, game theory existed, where he maybe could have calculated his options. And they had a group of people giving information about what to do. You could go this way, you could go that way. And he basically just made the decision and was saying, look, we're going to go down road A. And one of the kids said to him, he said, well, why did you decide road A and you didn't have all the information? He said, well, but by the speed that we're getting the information to me, I will come to the correct decision faster by just picking an option. And then I'll realize halfway down the road, this was either the right road or the wrong road. And I think as far as for a lot of people, because they maybe don't understand the game theory side of things or the maths, etc. Sometimes, I've found this in my own life, and as you said, reducing the options or just going for something and seeing what's going to work or not. Do you think that's a valid alternative, or do you feel that, given obviously your expertise, that it's better to try and work out an outcome that's going to be most favorable first?
Well, yeah. Dealing with the unknown is actually a place where traditional game theory sort of falls down, because strategic situations in the face of the unknown it's just sort of like dividing by zero. It doesn't really mean anything anymore.
Yeah.
However, computational mathematics, which is sort of my primary interest in, game theory is a tool that I've used in building these computational systems, does give us sort of vast access to the unknown, because the sort of fundamental theorem of computation is the existence of incomputability, things that can't be worked out or known in any way. And a very large proportion, we don't actually know how large, because that's one of the things you can't compute, of the things that a computational system can do are not really computable. And systems become computational at an incredibly low level of complexity. So you are dealing with computational, even if you're living in a yurt in the woods off the grid, just genetics actually work exactly like a Turing machine. So every living thing you encounter is a computational system. And so a thing that we have to cope with is not merely unknown, but almost unknowable things are a common currency of our world. And so in that respect, risks have to be taken. And that's where, this Nash equilibrium evolutionary game thing comes in. As an individual, you got to go with your gut, and sort of what happens. And by having many individuals doing things, that's where we as a society can sort of figure out where the breakpoints are. Like, that guy got too close to the cliff and he fell over. That's a bad idea. This guy never went anywhere near it and he didn't get to see the view. That's a bad idea. These people, got great holiday pictures and all of their children came home with them. Let's do what those people are doing. So, in that sense, building ways for small groups or individuals to operate at the edge of our society gives us the best of both worlds. It lets us see what the explorations of the edge look like, without having to take every single one of those risks personally. And we're seeing a strong move towards centralization, ossification. Governments are growing very large. Companies are growing very large. Let me try this. I've been thinking about this analogy for the last week or so. glass and sand are made out of exactly the same material, but they respond to shock very differently. If you have a piece of glass, sort of a pile of glass, a lump of glass, if you will, and hit it with a hammer, yes, the glass atoms, the silicon atoms that are up there all get a sharp shock, but there's also splintering, and effectively the entire lump breaks into pieces. But if you've got a pile of sand and you hit it with a hammer, yeah, it's bad once again for the silicon atoms that you're hitting. But basically, when you come up, you still just got a pile of sand there. The force dissipates, the pile rearranges, but it's still sort of a lump in a pile. And so societally, building systems that give individuals that choice, that ability to reach out to the edge, creates much more stable societies that just sort of keep looking like that lump of sand. And that's how we play this trial and error game in a good way, is by letting the daredevils take their shot and see what happens, without having all of us have to sort of buy into whatever happens. Because if everybody's just on one board, then once somebody finally makes a mistake, it all goes down together.
So just a sort of final two-part question then. One is, what have we not covered about game theory that you feel is worth knowing for the guests? And secondly, who's your target market for your computational mathematical product/service?
Well, game theory is so vast and deep that it's the kind of thing that it's worth the skim. And I think we took a sort of very good dip off the top, but it's worth the dive as well. So I would say that would be the lesson to take home, not that there's this one other thing that we didn't quite talk about, but that there's sort of this vast ocean of other dips to take out that can be very valuable. And so go explore. There's some excellent books on the subject, and there's actually a lot of well-made content out there that will let you know many different things in game theory. In terms of the markets that I'm targeting, I'm looking for market operators, brokers, industry associations that have an interest in the buying or selling of inputs or outputs, that are aware of the collapse and problems of the existing system and need an alternative in order to keep themselves going, and want to actually be one of those people that's pushing out the boundaries and taking that risk. And for them, I've got a brand new technology to incorporate and build their own pile of sand, basically.
Excellent. So final question that's actually not related to the game theory side. What's one part of your life that you wish you could improve on?
My health. Really, like I was a sickly kid. I do a little better now that everybody's in permanent lockdown and I don't really see people all that often. But my primary memory of second grade is having strep throat. I think I got it 3 or 4 times. I don't even remember, I barely remember second grade because of that. So yeah, I wish I was more robust in that fashion. But yeah, that's it.
Why do you think that is? Do you think it's a genetic thing? Do you think it's an exercise thing? Do you think it's a diet thing? Do you think it's how do you think it's any of those things, or is it just luck of the draw, would you say?
I'd say it's probably a combination of those. In some sense, we're all sickly children.
Yeah.
Because we have public hygiene now, and it used to be the case that roughly half of people died in childhood of something, and we haven't been doing that in the West here for 4 or 5 generations. So you and your parents and their parents, and in many cases their parents and their parents, in all likelihood would have died in childhood, except sewers and stuff like that have been built, and we don't have those problems. But the kind of lonerism that I've adopted as a result of getting sick when I'm around people probably doesn't help with maintaining a robust system. And so, yeah, it's one of those things where it might have been a small deviation leading to a path, or it might be a large deviation that I'm just reacting to. But that's the aspect of my life that I wish was different.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much for sharing, Noah. If you could just let the guests know where they can reach you if they wanted to reach out to you.
Absolutely. So I have an email address, noahphealy@yahoo.com, that I respond to quite reasonably, and the spam filter is not that aggressive. And also you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm just plain old Noah Healy there. And if you want to learn more about my computational system, and there's actually some links for videos about game theory and my system as well there, coordisc.com, CORDISC, is my website.
Excellent. Well, we'll leave that in the notes comment anyway, just in case people can't transcribe that down. So yeah, have you got any sort of final messages for anyone out there?
No, I think we basically covered everything.
Excellent, Noah. So, well, thanks very much for being a guest. And yeah, hopefully everyone out there had a fantastic experience and have learned something new about game theory and how interesting it can be.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much again, Noah.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.